Number 10. Constantine the Great. History remembers him as Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor of Rome, the man who united a fractured empire, founded the glorious city of Constantinople, and laid the groundwork for 1,000 years of Byzantine rule. In the annals of history, he is portrayed as a visionary, a saintly figure chosen by God. But saints can have secrets, and Constantine's was drenched in the blood of his firstborn son. His son was named Crispus. By all accounts, he was the perfect Roman heir. He was handsome, charismatic, and a military genius. While still a young man, Crispus led his father's armies to decisive victories against the Franks and the Goths. He commanded the fleet that smashed the navy of his father's rival, Licinius, securing Constantine's place as the sole ruler of the Roman world. Crispus was celebrated on coins, praised in poems, and loved by both the army and the people. He was the bright future of the empire and Constantine's greatest asset. But in the viper's nest of the imperial court, an asset can quickly become a threat. Constantine's second wife, the Empress Fausta, was the mother of his other, younger sons. She saw Crispus not as a stepson, but as a rival to her own children's inheritance, and she decided to remove him from the board. In the year 326 AD, while the imperial court was in modern-day Croatia, Fausta made her move. She went to Constantine with a horrifying accusation that his beloved son, the heroic Crispus, had tried to seduce her, that he had betrayed his father in the most intimate and disgusting way possible. For Constantine, a man whose entire reign was built on crushing his rivals, the accusation was poison in his ear. We will never know if he truly believed it, or if Faustus simply gave him the excuse his own growing paranoia was looking for. He didn't order a trial. He didn't allow Crispus to face his accuser. The celebrated commander, the heir to the Roman Empire, was arrested in secret. Constantine, the father, signed the death warrant for his own son. Crispus was taken away and quietly executed, most likely by poison. His name was erased from public monuments, his existence officially wiped from history in an act the Romans called damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. But the story doesn't end there. Soon after, Constantine's own mother Helena was devastated by her grandson's death. She began to investigate and uncovered the truth. Fausta had lied. Her entire story was a fabrication designed to eliminate a rival. Constantine's reaction was not one of quiet grief. It was an explosion of imperial rage. The man who had just murdered his son on the word of his wife now turned that same cold fury upon her. He condemned the Empress Fausta to death. Her execution was pure horror. She was taken to the palace baths, where the doors were sealed shut and the water was heated until she was boiled alive in a cloud of steam. Constantine the Great would go on to rule for another decade, forever changing the course of Western civilization, but his reign is permanently scarred by the events of 326 AD. He killed his perfect heir based on a lie, and then brutally executed the liar. The Christian emperor, the supposed man of God, built his later reign on a foundation of filicide and familial slaughter, a dark truth that serves as a chilling reminder that behind every great man in history, there is often a monster. Number 9. Ivan the Terrible. There are few names in history that so perfectly summarize a ruler's legacy as Ivan the Terrible. He is the archetypal Russian Tsar, a figure of absolute terrifying power, with a crown on his head and blood on his hands. But he was not born a monster. For the first half of his reign, he was Ivan the Awesome, a brilliant reformer, a devout Christian, and a conqueror who dramatically expanded the borders of Russia. He introduced self-government, reformed the army, and commissioned the construction of the magnificent St. Basil's Cathedral. The turning point was the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned by the boyars, the scheming Russian nobility. Her death broke something deep inside him. The intelligent, promising Tsar descended into a vortex of paranoia and rage. He created the Oprichnina, a state within a state, and unleashed his black-clad secret police, the Oprichniki, upon his own people. They rode across the land with a dog's head and a broom hanging from their saddles, symbols of their mission to sniff out treason and sweep it from Russia. They were his personal instrument of terror, and for years they drowned the country in blood. At the heart of this storm was Ivan's relationship with his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan. The young Tsarevich was intelligent, ruthless, and the only person who seemed capable of standing up to his father's volcanic temper. He was a product of his father's reign, as cruel and capable as Ivan himself, and the only viable future for the dynasty. But in a court built on fear, a capable heir looks dangerously like a rival. The end came not in a calculated plot, but in a sudden, domestic explosion of fury. In November of 1581, inside the walls of the Alexandrov Kremlin, the 51-year-old Tsar entered his son's chambers. There, he saw his son's pregnant wife, Yelena, dressed in what he considered to be immodest clothing. She was wearing only a single undergarment, not the required 3 layers. Ivan exploded. He began screaming at her, beating her for her indecency. The assault was so violent that Yelena miscarried their child the following day. Hearing his wife's screams, the younger Ivan rushed into the room and threw himself between them, screaming back at his father, "You sent my first wife to a convent for no reason. You have done the same with my second, and now you strike the third, to kill the son you have given me." He had challenged the Tsar. He had questioned his absolute authority. In that moment, the paranoid emperor saw not his son, but a traitor. In his hand, Ivan held his heavy iron-tipped staff, a possak he always carried. Blinded by rage, he swung it. The heavy pointed end smashed into his son's temple. The instant the blow landed, Ivan's fury vanished, replaced by horror. The scene is immortalized in Ilya Repin's famous painting. The Tsar, with wide, terrified eyes, cradling his dying son, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding with his own hands, pressing his lips to the wound as if he could kiss the life back into him. But it was too late. The heir to all of Russia lay dying on the floor, murdered by his own father in a fit of rage. For the next 4 days, the Tsarevich lingered between life and death. And for 4 days, Ivan the Terrible descended into madness. He never left his son's side. He howled in grief, praying to God for a miracle and damning himself for what he had done. When his son finally died, the Tsar's sanity shattered completely. He roamed the palace at night, wailing like a wounded animal, his cries echoing through the cold stone halls. He wanted to abdicate his throne and retreat to a monastery, but his own boyars, fearing the chaos that would follow, refused to let him. The murder of the Tsarevich was more than a family tragedy. It was a national catastrophe. Ivan the Terrible was never the same. He was a broken man, haunted by the ghost of the son he had killed, and his own health declined rapidly until his death 3 years later. With his capable heir dead, the throne passed to his younger son, the pious but mentally feeble Fyodor. Fyodor's childless death ended the Rurik dynasty, plunging Russia into a devastating civil war known as the Time of Troubles. By killing his son in a single moment of rage, Ivan didn't just murder a man, he murdered the future of his own dynasty and condemned his country to years of chaos and bloodshed. For this next case, we travel forward in Russian history. The story of Ivan the Terrible was a tragedy born of uncontrollable rage. But a century and a half later, another great Tsar would face a similar problem with his heir. This time, however, there would be no sudden explosion of fury. There would only be cold, methodical, political calculation. This is a story about a father who loved his creation more than his child. Number 8. Peter the Great. Peter the Great was not a man. He was a force of nature, a giant, standing nearly 7 feet tall, with a will of iron and a vision that would forever change the face of his nation. He inherited a medieval, landlocked Russia and was determined to drag it, kicking and screaming, into the modern world. He built a new capital on a swamp, named it St. Petersburg, and called it his window to the West. He created the Russian Navy from nothing, reformed the government, secularized schools, and personally waged war against the old traditions he despised. He was a builder, a warrior, a visionary, and one of the most ruthless rulers in history. His firstborn son and heir, Alexei Petrovich, was everything Peter was not. Where Peter was loud, violent, and progressive, Alexei was quiet, passive, and deeply traditional. He hated his father's reforms, which he saw as a blasphemous attack on the soul of Holy Russia. He found solace not in shipbuilding or military strategy, but in the church, surrounded by the conservative clergy, and old guard nobility, who despised Peter's new world. To Peter, his son was more than a disappointment. He was a living symbol of the backwardness he was trying to destroy. The conflict between them was an ideological war played out in a father-son relationship. Peter tried to forge Alexei into a modern prince, but the boy resisted at every turn. Finally, Peter issued a brutal ultimatum. Either embrace your duties as my heir, or renounce your claim to the throne and be locked away in a monastery for the rest of your life. Faced with this impossible choice, Alexei made a fatal mistake. In 1716, he fled Russia. He sought protection from his brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna, effectively defecting to a foreign power. For Peter the Great, this was the ultimate act of betrayal. His son was no longer just a disappointment. He was a traitor, a pawn that could be used by Russia's enemies. Peter dispatched his most ruthless secret agent to track Alexei down. He was eventually cornered in Naples and lured back to Russia with a solemn promise from his father. If you confess everything and return willingly, I will grant you my pardon. Alexei, naive and desperate, believed him. The moment he set foot back in Moscow, the trap snapped shut. The pardon was a lie. Peter immediately stripped Alexei of his right to the succession and began a massive investigation to unearth a supposed conspiracy. The heir to the throne was imprisoned in the dreaded Peter and Paul fortress in St. Petersburg. What followed was not a quiet execution, but a slow, methodical process of state-sanctioned torture. Peter wanted a confession. He wanted the names of everyone who supported his son. Alexei was interrogated under torture repeatedly. He was lashed with the knout, a thick leather whip that could strip flesh from bone. And in a horrifying display of detached cruelty, Peter the Great, his father, was present for some of these sessions, watching as his own son was brutalized by his command. Under the agony of the whip, Alexei confessed to wanting his father dead and implicated dozens of others. It was enough. Peter put his own son on trial for high treason. The court, composed of Peter's highest officials, knew what was expected of them. They unanimously found Alexei guilty and sentenced him to death. But the official execution never came. On July 7, 1718, 2 days after the sentence was passed, Tsarevich Alexei Petrovich died in his cell. The official cause was apoplexy, or a stroke. The reality is that he died from the shock and trauma inflicted during his final round of torture. His body, broken by his father's orders, had simply given out. The death of Alexei demonstrated the terrifying extent of Peter's will. He proved that he would sacrifice anything, even his own firstborn son, for the sake of his vision for the Russian Empire. He secured his reforms, but at the cost of his own bloodline. The act cemented his dual legacy: Peter the Great, the visionary modernizer of Russia, and Peter the Terrible, the father who tortured his own child to death to protect the state he had built. He loved the empire more than the heir, and in doing so, became one of history's most chilling examples of political filicide. We've seen murder from paranoia, rage, and cold political calculation. Now we journey to the ancient world, to the sun-scorched hills of Judea, to witness a reign so steeped in familial bloodshed that it became a legend. This is the story of a king whose terror of being replaced turned him into a serial killer of his own children. Number 7. Herod the Great. He is known to history as Herod the Great, the king of Judea, who ruled under the watchful eye of Rome. He was a master builder on an epic scale, responsible for monumental projects like the grand expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, the impregnable fortress at Masada, and the magnificent port city of Caesarea. He was a cunning and effective ruler who brought decades of stability and Hellenistic culture to a notoriously turbulent region. But behind the facade of the great builder was a mind consumed by a pathological, all-consuming paranoia. Herod's greatest insecurity was his own legitimacy. He was an Idumean, an outsider, ruling over the Jewish people. He married into the previous dynasty, taking the beautiful Hasmonean princess Mariamne as his wife. He seemed to genuinely love her, but he also feared her royal blood, a bloodline more legitimate than his own, which flowed in the veins of their two sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. They were his handsome, popular, and deeply loved heirs, and in Herod's fracturing mind, that made them his greatest threat. His paranoia was stoked by the vipers in his own court, especially his sister Salome, who despised the Hasmonean queen. Whispers of plots and infidelity began to poison Herod's thoughts. His love for Mariamne curdled into suspicion, and in a fit of jealous rage, he had his beloved wife tried on a false charge of adultery and executed. It was his first step into the abyss, and it was an act that would haunt him and drive him to further atrocities. Having killed the mother, Herod's paranoia now metastasized, latching onto her sons. He saw Alexander and Aristobulus not as his children, but as his wife's avengers. He imagined they were plotting to overthrow him and reclaim their Hasmonean birthright. After years of public accusations, sham reconciliations, and 2 separate trials, Herod finally got the permission he needed from his Roman overlord, Emperor Augustus. In 7 BC, Alexander and Aristobulus, the sons of his favorite wife, were taken to the city of Sebaste and strangled to death by their own father's command. But the bloodletting wasn't over. Herod's firstborn son from another marriage, Antipater, had been a key player in scheming against his 2 half-brothers, hoping to clear his own path to the throne. But now that they were gone, Herod's ever-suspicious gaze fell upon him. Herod discovered that Antipater was now plotting against him, and the cycle began anew. The final act of this family tragedy is its most grotesque. By this time, Herod himself was an old man, dying from a horrific and painful disease that was rotting his body from the inside out. Yet even on his deathbed, his paranoia raged. He had Antipater dragged from prison and executed. He murdered his 3rd son just 5 days before he himself finally died. His cruelty became infamous throughout the Roman world. It was Emperor Augustus himself who, upon hearing of Herod's latest execution of a son, reportedly remarked with grim irony, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." The logic was simple. As a Jew, Herod did not eat pork, which meant his pigs were safer than his own children. Herod's building projects were so magnificent that they earned him the title, the Great. But it is a title forever dripping with irony. His true legacy is not written in stone, but in blood. He was a king, so consumed by the fear of losing his power that he systematically butchered his own family, destroying the very dynasty he hoped to build. The biblical story of the massacre of the innocents, where Herod supposedly orders the murder of all male infants in Bethlehem, is likely a legend. But it is a legend that endures because it captures the essential truth of his reign. He was a monster on the throne, a tyrant for whom no one, not even the children who shared his blood, was safe from his madness. From the paranoid hills of Judea, we now travel to the opulent, glittering court of the Ottoman Empire at its absolute zenith. Here, we find a ruler known as the Magnificent, a man who presided over a golden age of art and law. But even the brightest light casts a dark shadow, and his was a story of love, conspiracy, and a betrayal committed in the chilling silence of an imperial tent. Number 6. Suleiman the Magnificent. In his own lands, he was Kanuni, the lawgiver. As Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, he ruled over a vast territory stretching from Hungary to Persia. His reign was the undisputed golden age of Ottoman power. The arts flourished, the law was codified, and the armies of the Sultan seemed invincible. Suleiman himself was a brilliant military commander, a gifted poet, and a ruler of immense intellect and prestige. His firstborn son was Shahzad, or Prince Mustafa, and he was the perfect heir. Handsome, brave, and a talented poet like his father, Mustafa was also a skilled warrior and a beloved provincial governor. He was wildly popular with the people, and, most importantly, he was adored by the Janissaries, the elite infantry units that formed the backbone of the Ottoman army. To everyone in the empire, the succession was clear. When the great Suleiman passed, the equally great Mustafa would take his place. But the line of succession is never truly safe in the serpentine world of the imperial harem. While Mustafa was the son of Suleiman's consort, Mahidevran, the Sultan's heart and legal wife was a former slave girl of Ruthenian origin named Hurrem Sultan, known to the West as Roxilana. Hurrem was intelligent, charming, and ruthlessly ambitious. She had borne Suleiman several sons of her own, and she was determined that one of them, not Mustafa, would inherit the throne. Allied with her son-in-law, the powerful Grand Vizier, Rustam Pasha, Hurrem began a masterful, slow-burn campaign of psychological warfare against her own husband. They fed the aging sultan a constant stream of whispers about Mustafa's ambition. They spoke of his popularity with the army, framing it not as a strength for the empire, but as a threat to Suleiman himself. They intercepted letters, forged new ones, and created a narrative that Mustafa, backed by the Janissaries, was preparing to march on the capital and usurp his father's throne, just as Suleiman's own father had done to his predecessor. Suleiman, a man who had survived countless plots, finally succumbed to the one brewing in his own bedchamber. He believed the lies. In 1553, during a military campaign against Persia, the Sultan summoned Mustafa to his imperial tent in the encampment. Mustafa, despite his advisors warning him it could be a trap, went willingly to greet his father. He left his weapons behind as a sign of respect and entered the vast tent, expecting to kiss his father's hand. He found no greeting. Inside, waiting in chilling silence, were the Sultan's deaf-mute executioners, the designated stranglers of the Ottoman court, used so that the sacred royal blood would not be spilled. They threw a silk bowstring around the prince's neck. A desperate struggle ensued. The powerful Mustafa fought fiercely for his life, nearly overpowering his attackers. But there were too many. As his son fought for his last breath, Suleiman the Magnificent watched from behind a linen screen, a silent witness to the murder he had commanded. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. When news of Mustafa's death reached the soldiers, the camp erupted in fury. The Janissaries, who had revered Mustafa as their future leader, were on the verge of open mutiny. They stormed the Grand Vizier's tent, blaming him for the plot. To save his own throne from the rage of his army, Suleiman did the only thing he could. He publicly dismissed Rustam Pasha, sacrificing his co-conspirator to appease the troops. The tragedy was compounded when another of Suleiman's sons, Siangir, who was deeply devoted to his half-brother Mustafa, died just a few weeks later, reportedly from shock and grief. One murder had claimed 2 of his children. Suleiman the Magnificent would rule for another 13 years, but the execution of Mustafa is the indelible stain upon his golden reign. He eliminated his most capable and beloved son based on lies spun by those he trusted most. Many historians argue this was a catastrophic turning point for the empire. By executing Mustafa, Suleiman paved the way for a less competent son, Selim II, to inherit the throne, beginning a long, slow era of decline known as the Sultanate of Women, where harem politics, not merit, dictated the fate of the world's most powerful empire. Suleiman secured his power for the moment, but in doing so, may have doomed the future of the very dynasty he sought to protect. We now turn our gaze from the west to the east, to the intricate and deadly world of Imperial China. Our next story is about a ruler who not only murdered their child, but did so with a level of cunning and ambition that is almost unparalleled. This is the story of a woman who clawed her way from a concubine's bed to the dragon throne, and who allegedly used the body of her own infant daughter as the first rung on the ladder to absolute power. Number 5. Wu Zetian. In the long male-dominated history of China, there has only ever been one woman to rule as emperor in her own right. Wu Zetian. Her story is a masterclass in political maneuvering, ruthless ambition, and shocking brutality. She began her journey not as a princess, but as a minor, 14-year-old concubine to Emperor Taizong of the Tang dynasty. Upon his death, tradition dictated she should have been sent to a Buddhist monastery for the rest of her life. But Wu was no ordinary woman. She defied fate, charmed her way out of the convent, and managed to enter the harem of the new emperor. Taizong's own son, Gaozong, once inside the palace walls again, her rise was meteoric. She quickly became Emperor Gaozong's favorite, but she had one major obstacle: the childless Empress Wang. Wu knew that to gain ultimate power, she had to eliminate the Empress and take her place. To do that, she needed a weapon, and according to her enemies and the historical accounts they wrote, the weapon she chose was her own newborn child. In the year 654, Wu gave birth to a daughter. One day, Empress Wang, who was fond of children, came to visit the infant. Shortly after the Empress left the room, Wu allegedly returned to the cradle. What happened next is the act that cemented her terrifying legend. She secretly smothered her own 1-week-old daughter, killing her in her sleep. Then she calmly covered the baby back up. When Emperor Gaizong came to see the child, Wu pulled back the covers with a smile, only to reveal the lifeless infant. She burst into theatrical tears, questioned the servants, who all reported that Empress Wang was the last person to visit. The accusation was clear. Emperor Gaizong was enraged. He was convinced that the jealous, childless empress had murdered his new baby out of spite. Despite a lack of any real evidence, he deposed Empress Wang, who was later executed on Wu's orders in a gruesome manner. Her hands and feet were cut off, and her body was thrown into a large vat of wine to drown. Wu Zetian had won. She was now the new Empress of China. But her ambition did not end there. After Emperor Gaizong suffered a debilitating stroke, Wu became the effective ruler of the empire. When he finally died, she was not content to be a mere regent for her sons. She wanted the throne for herself. Her eldest son, Li Hong, died suddenly, possibly poisoned. Her next son, Li Ziyan, was installed as emperor. But when he began to assert his authority, Wu had him deposed, exiled, and years later, sent forces to his place of exile that compelled him to commit suicide. She then placed her youngest, most pliable son, Li Dan, on the throne as a puppet before forcing him to abdicate entirely. In the year 690, Wu Zetian shattered thousands of years of tradition. She declared the founding of her own dynasty, the Zhou, and took the title of emperor, the only woman in Chinese history to ever do so. For 15 years, Wu Zetian ruled China with an iron fist. It must be said that she was an effective and capable ruler. She expanded the empire's borders, reformed the government by promoting talented officials from lower classes, and ruled over a period of relative peace and prosperity. But her legacy is forever stained by her ruthless path to power. The story of her smothering her own daughter, whether it is historical fact or a masterful piece of political slander written by the Confucian historians who despised her, has defined her for centuries. It serves as the ultimate symbol of her terrifying ambition. A woman willing to sacrifice anything and anyone, even her own innocent child, to capture and hold on to a power that no woman had ever held before. We have witnessed murders driven by rage, ambition, and cold strategy. Now, we travel to the heart of the mighty Spanish Empire, ruled by the most powerful man in the world. This is not a story of a clear-cut execution, but something perhaps more sinister, a dark mystery, a problematic heir, and a quiet death in a locked room that has fueled speculation for centuries. Number 4. Philip II of Spain. King Philip II of Spain was, for a time, the most powerful man on earth. From his grim, granite palace monastery of El Escorial, he ruled a global empire that spanned from the Philippines to the Americas, an empire on which the sun never set. He was a deeply devout Catholic, a meticulous micromanager, and a somber, brooding figure who saw himself as God's chosen defender of the faith. But the vastness of his empire was matched only by the depth of his family's dysfunction. His firstborn son and heir was Don Carlos, the Prince of Asturias. From birth, the boy was a product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. He was physically frail, with a stutter and a deformed shoulder. His mental state was even more precarious. A serious head injury as a teenager shattered what little stability he had, plunging him into fits of uncontrollable rage and sadistic cruelty. He reportedly enjoyed roasting animals alive, forcing a shoemaker to eat shoes he'd made too tight, and once tried to throw a servant out of a window. Don Carlos was not just a disappointment. He was a dangerous, mentally unstable liability. As he grew older, his hatred for his father became an obsession. He despised Philip's trusted advisors and leaked state secrets to his father's enemies. The final straw came when Don Carlos made plans to flee Spain and join the rebellion in the Netherlands, intending to lead Protestant rebels against his own Catholic father. For King Philip, This was not just treason against the state, it was heresy against God. On the night of January 18, 1568, Philip made his move. In a scene of breathtaking drama, the king himself, clad in armor and carrying a sword, burst into his son's chambers accompanied by 4 armed guards. Don Carlos, terrified, reached for a weapon, but was quickly subdued. Philip placed his own son under arrest, declaring him unfit to rule and ordering him into strict solitary confinement. The heir to the Spanish throne was now a prisoner in his own father's palace. What happened next is shrouded in mystery and propaganda. The official story from the Spanish court was that Don Carlos essentially killed himself through his own erratic behavior. Imprisoned and stripped of his dignity, he descended further into madness, alternating between starving himself and engaging in massive binges. He was said to have swallowed ice, slept naked on the cold stone floor, and made himself violently ill. According to the official version, he died 6 months after his arrest from a raging fever brought on by these self-abuses. But no one in the royal courts of Europe believed it. Philip's enemies, particularly the Protestant Dutch, spread a much darker version of the story, that the most Catholic king had his own son secretly poisoned in his cell. This narrative became a cornerstone of the Black Legend of Spain, painting Philip as a monstrous tyrant. Was it a deliberate murder? Or was it death by calculated neglect? With Philip imprisoning his son in conditions he knew he would not survive. The king never offered a public explanation. He locked his son away, and 6 months later, his problem was solved. The true cause of Don Carlos's death remains one of history's great unsolved royal mysteries. Philip II never betrayed any emotion over the incident, simply remarking that he had been willing to sacrifice his own son to God and the good of his state. He may not have ordered an executioner, but he undeniably created the prison that became his son's tomb. The story of the tormented prince and the cold, unyielding king has echoed through the centuries, inspiring famous plays and operas. It cemented Philip's image as a grim, unforgiving monarch and a father who, when faced with a broken heir, chose not to heal him, but to erase him from the world. Our journey has taken us through palaces poisoned by paranoia, rage, and ambition. Now we travel back to the very birth of an empire, to witness an act of filicide that was not seen as a crime, but as the ultimate expression of civic virtue. This is the story of a man who founded a republic and was then forced to make a terrible choice: be a father or be a patriot. Number 3. Lucius Junius Brutus. The name Brutus is forever linked with the defense of liberty. But centuries before Marcus Brutus assassinated Julius Caesar, his ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, etched the name into Roman history with an act of terrifying, iron-willed resolve. In 509 BC, Brutus led the revolt that overthrew Rome's last king, the tyrant Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. He was the father of the Roman Republic, elected as one of its first 2 consuls, the highest office in the new government. He was the living symbol of Rome's newfound freedom from the tyranny of kings. But the new republic was fragile. Not all of Rome's elite were happy to have lost their monarch. A conspiracy was soon formed among a group of disgruntled young aristocrats to overthrow the republic and restore the Tarquin monarchy. They plotted in secret to open the gates of Rome to the deposed king's army. Letters were written, oaths were sworn, and the fate of the young republic hung in the balance. The plot was discovered when a slave overheard the conspirators and revealed their plan to the consuls. When the list of traitors was unsealed, it delivered a devastating blow to the heart of the new government and to the heart of its founder. Among the ringleaders were Brutus's own 2 sons, Titus and Tiberius. The city was in shock. The founder's own children had betrayed the revolution. All of Rome now looked to one man, Brutus. He was not only the boys' father. As consul, he was their judge. He faced an impossible choice: He could act as a father and use his power to pardon his sons, an act of mercy that would undermine the rule of law before it had even begun. Or he could act as the consul of Rome, upholding the law with brutal impartiality, and condemn his own children to a traitor's death. What followed became one of the foundational legends of Roman virtue. The conspirators, including his two sons, were dragged into the Roman Forum. Brutus took his seat on the curule chair, the symbol of his consular authority. The evidence was presented. The guilt was undeniable. The crowd and his fellow senators pleaded with him, some with tears, to show mercy. But Brutus remained unmoved, his face a mask of stone. He gave the order. The lictors, his official bodyguards, seized his sons. They stripped them, tied them to stakes, and beat them bloody with rods as the crowd watched in horrified silence. Then came the final, terrible command. Brutus did not turn away, he did not flinch. He sat and forced himself to watch as the lictors drew their axes and beheaded both of his sons. The historian Livy wrote that while the executions took place, the father's face was a spectacle of his conflicting emotions. As the patriot's resolve triumphed over the feelings of the father, he had made his choice. Rome came before family. The law came before love. The public execution of his own children cemented Lucius Junius Brutus as the ultimate Roman hero. His act was seen not as murder, but as a necessary and terrible sacrifice to consecrate the new republic in the blood of traitors, proving that no one, not even his own family, was above the law. For centuries, his story was held up as the supreme example of republican virtue and duty to the state. But it remains a chilling tale. The story of a founding father, to give his new nation life, had to become the executioner of his own sons, a personal tragedy that became the bedrock of an empire. We are now approaching the pinnacle of our list. The final few cases represent the most shocking and impactful stories of royal filicide. For our number 2 spot, we look to a king who was one of Rome's most brilliant and tenacious enemies, a ruler so obsessed with power and so terrified of his foes that he became an expert in the world's deadliest substances. But his greatest poison was not in a vial. It was the pride that led him to demand his children follow him into death. Number 2, Mithridates VI of Pontus. For over 40 years, one man was the Roman Republic's recurring nightmare. His name was Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, a burgeoning empire on the shores of the Black Sea. He was no mere barbarian chieftain. He was a brilliant, charismatic, and terrifyingly resilient opponent. He spoke over 20 languages, commanded massive armies, and was so wealthy that his treasury seemed bottomless. He challenged the full might of Rome not once, not twice, but in 3 separate continent-spanning wars. But above all, Mithridates was known by a singular, chilling epithet: the Poison King. From a young age, having survived assassination attempts by his own mother, Mithridates developed a deep, pathological obsession with toxicology. He methodically studied every known venom and poison. Legend says that he spent his entire life ingesting a daily cocktail of sublethal doses of these poisons, a practice that became known as Mithridatism. His goal was to make himself immune, to become physically untouchable by the assassin's favorite tool. He was a man who had conquered fear by literally consuming it. This obsession would define not only his life, but also the horrifying, ironic circumstances of his death. After decades of brutal warfare against Rome's greatest generals, Sulla, Lucullus, and finally Pompey the Great, the aging king was cornered. His armies were shattered, his empire was lost, and he was holed up in his last citadel in the Crimea. Yet even in defeat, his pride and hatred for Rome burned as brightly as ever. He was planning one final, insane gamble, a desperate land-based invasion of Italy itself, marching his barbarian army through the Alps like a new Hannibal. But his soldiers, exhausted and broken after a lifetime of war, had finally had enough. They saw no glory in his plan, only suicide. Their loyalty shifted. They turned to the man they saw as their only hope for survival. Mithridates' own favorite son and chosen heir, Pharnaces II, seeing his father as a madman leading them all to ruin, seized the opportunity. He betrayed his king, his father, and accepted the acclamations of the mutinying army. They proclaimed Pharnaces their new king. For Mithridates, this was the ultimate blow. He was trapped. The army outside his walls was no longer his. His own son was his enemy. The capture he had avoided his entire life was now imminent. The thought of being dragged through the streets of Rome in chains, to be paraded as a trophy in Pompey's triumph, was a humiliation his colossal pride could not endure. He decided he would die a king, and his final act of royal authority would be to command the deaths of his own family. He would not allow his daughters to become Roman prisoners or political pawns. Their fate, he decided, was tied to his. He gathered his remaining loyal daughters, Mithridates and Nyssa, who were betrothed to the kings of Egypt and Cyprus. They were princesses with brilliant futures, but their father offered them a different destiny. He presented them with poison, praising their courage and telling them that this was the only way to escape the humiliation of Roman captivity. In a final horrifying act of filial piety, the princesses took the poison from their father's hand, drank it, and died at his feet. Then, the poison king took the vial for himself. He drained the remaining poison, expecting a swift end. But nothing happened. His body, so carefully conditioned over a lifetime of Mithridatism, had become his own worst enemy. The poison that had just killed his children had no effect on him. The ultimate irony was complete. He had made himself immune to the only escape he had left. As he heard the soldiers of his treacherous son storming the palace gates, panic set in. He tried to kill himself with his sword, but was too old and weakened. In his final, desperate moments, Mithridates, the great enemy of Rome, the Poison King, had to beg his loyal Gallic bodyguard to do what he could not. He turned to his friend and ordered him to run him through with his sword. Mithridates' life was a testament to his unbreakable will, but his death was a spectacle of prideful tyranny. Betrayed by the son he loved, he chose to drag his daughters into his own grave rather than suffer the indignity of defeat. His final act was not that of a loving father, but of a possessive master refusing to let go of his property. He murdered his children to deny his enemy a complete victory, a final, selfish spasm of defiance from the king, who had so perfected the art of poison that he had forgotten how to die. We have seen rulers kill for duty, for ambition, for politics, and out of paranoia. We have seen rage and cold calculation. For our final #1 spot, we journey to the heart of the ancient world's first superpower, the mighty Persian Empire. Here we find a king burdened by the legacy of a great father, a king who, in his quest to live up to that legacy, descended into a madness so profound that he waged war on gods, on his family, and ultimately on his own unborn child. Number 1. Cambyses II of Persia. Imagine being the son of Cyrus the Great. Your father is a legend, a figure so revered for his wisdom, mercy, and skill that centuries later he would be held up as the model of a perfect ruler. He founded the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest the world had ever seen. The expectations for his son and heir, Cambyses II, were nothing short of monumental. He was expected to be a conqueror, a leader, and a legend in his own right. He would indeed become a conqueror, but his legend would not be one of greatness, but of a horrifying descent into jealousy, sacrilege, and madness. His darkness revealed itself early. Before embarking on the greatest quest of his reign, the conquest of Egypt, Cambyses looked at his own full brother, Bardia. Bardia was popular and capable, and Cambyses was consumed by a venomous jealousy. He feared that Bardia might try to seize the throne while he was away. So, before he even marched his army out of Persia, Cambyses had his brother secretly assassinated. No one else knew. As far as the world was concerned, Prince Bardia was still alive. This secret act of fratricide was the seed from which all of Cambyses' future horrors would grow. Cambyses then marched on Egypt, the last great independent kingdom of the ancient world, and conquered it with brutal efficiency. He was now pharaoh of Egypt and king of Persia, the undisputed master of the known world. But this ultimate victory did not satisfy him. It unhinged him. He shattered Persian tradition by marrying two of his own full sisters. And it was with one of them, his pregnant wife and sister, that he would commit his most monstrous act. According to the historian Herodotus, one day the royal couple was watching two puppies fight. When one puppy began to lose, another puppy broke free from its leash and rushed to help its sibling, and together they defeated the other dog. Cambyses' sister wife began to weep. When he asked her why, she replied that it reminded her of their murdered brother, Bardia, who had no one to avenge him. Her words ignited a firestorm of rage in the king's unstable mind. He was confronted with his secret crime by the one person he could not silence. In a fit of pure fury, he lashed out. Herodotus reports that the mad king either kicked his pregnant sister violently in the stomach, or, in an even more gruesome telling, flew into a rage and performed a horrific, makeshift surgery on her, desperate to see the child in her womb. The result was the same. He killed her, and with her, his own unborn child and heir. In that moment, he had committed fratricide, incest, uxoricide, and filicide. He had declared war on his entire family. His madness only spiraled from there. He descended into alcoholism and sacrilege. He mocked Egyptian customs, publicly stabbed the sacred Apis bull, a living god in the eyes of the Egyptians, and had his most trusted advisors murdered on a whim. He had become a tyrant not just to his people, but to reality itself. And then, his first crime came back to haunt him. News arrived from Persia that a man claiming to be his brother Bardia had seized the throne. It was, in fact, an impostor, a magus named Gomata, who knew the real Bardia was dead and was exploiting the secret. Cambyses, realizing his empire was being stolen because of the murder he thought he had gotten away with, flew into a panic and began a mad dash back to Persia to confront the usurper. As he was mounting his horse, the cap of his sword scabbard fell off, leaving the blade exposed. The sword, jostled by his movement, pierced his own thigh. The wound began to fester with gangrene. As he lay dying, in agony, in a foreign land, the king finally confessed to his nobles the truth, that he had murdered the real Bardia years ago, and that the man on the throne was a fraud. He died in utter despair, his empire lost, his family destroyed, and his body rotted by a wound from his own blade. Cambyses II stands as one of history's most terrifying examples of a man crushed by the weight of his own legacy. He conquered the ancient kingdom of Egypt, but was ultimately defeated by his own inner demons. His jealousy led him to murder his brother. His rage led him to murder his sister and his own unborn child. And his sacrilege led to an ironic, almost divinely ordained death. He is the ultimate proof that a crown does not grant sanity, and that a king's worst enemy is often the one he sees in the mirror. His story is a chilling finale to our list, a brutal symphony of every type of familial betrayal, conducted by a madman on a throne. Power, paranoia, rage, ambition, and duty. We have seen rulers kill their children for all these reasons. They were kings, emperors, and sultans who held the world in their hands, but could not control the darkness in their own hearts. Their stories are a timeless and brutal warning about the corrupting nature of absolute power. But what do you think is the ultimate cause? Is it the pressure of the crown itself that drives these rulers mad? Or were these individuals simply monsters from the start, who just happened to find themselves in a position to act on their darkest impulses? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.